All right. Welcome, everybody. This is the Ibn Arabi Book Club. Today, we'll be talking about divine roots and secondary causes. So, I I gotta say, I think this Ibn Arabi talking about secondary causes really kind of put things in perspective for me in terms of we can look at anything that's secondary cause as forms, and that these forms can become, or their functionality can become veils for us that hide you could say, the primary cause, but at the same time they can also become almost like a very stubborn barrier that doesn't even allow us to see past the veils if we take them as lords. And I think that was the part that really stood out to me, was if we take some of the forms as lords, it can become almost solidified to where it prevents us from getting to the or maybe getting to know the essence itself. So I was actually really fascinated by that specific concept of secondary causes, forms, and how the veils can kind of have a link to the essence. But if we mistake the veils as, I guess you could say, the essence itself, then we run into problems. We start having some concretizing issues. So I'll just pass it on to you, Thomas.
I think for me, the part that really stood out, two parts. So one part is about the relationship pertaining to non-existence, because they do not refer to objects. But then another part in the same later on, the non-existent displays effects. So it's very saying. So if the whole point about I'm kind of moving a little further ahead, talking about relationships, right? They're not real. So it's kind of it's basically the typical example is the argument for nominalism in one sense, to say that when we say where's fatherhood, it's in an individual father with his son. Those are the real things, the father and the son. The relationship is not real. It's not an object. But yet, because they're non-existent, but yet the thing is, those non-existence display effects, which for me, that's kind of like related to this veiledness, right? This kind of bearing on this veiledness of the meaning and the forms. So the forms are the kinds of relationships. And and by the way, there's a whole section in the end that's the conversation with non-existence that names have, and kind of this literally kind of a caricaturing of the names speaking to with each other, with non-existence and with Allah, to create the effects. I mean, it's a very powerful image, right? I think that's actually the part where, I mean, we talked off record where I'm like, oh man, I wish I could read the real text of this, because this is crazy stuff here, because it could easily be misinterpreted to be polytheism or some other mode of that, but it's not Ibn Arabi's purpose here, and the author Charek is making that very clear. That's not what's happening here. It's a device of understanding of what's the dynamic at play. So for me, one of the things, I mean, one of my pet projects has always been the investigation of lack, right? Lack is basically not just it's not non-being. It's a kind of existence. It exists, but in a weird, it's fighting with our intuitions about what we mean by nothing versus lack. And this is just building on that language in the sense that lacks have effects. I actually remember we had a conversation with Michelle from OG Road where she said that exact line: lacks have effects, thus they're real in that sense. So I'm reminded of, shout out to Michelle. I'm actually talking to her tomorrow. Much love. So that's what reminded me reading that passage of the last note. Also, I was rereading Pierce, where his sense and reference distinctions, and I reminded instantly to this whole point at what's the reference is the essence of a law, right? That may not be knowable, but the sense is the difference, right? So we read that last week, and this is me. We saw that again this week talked about, but I'm using it now when I was re-listening to Pierce's essays about basically sense and reference dichotomy for language. It reminded me of that every time the reference is always the same. It's a law in the end, but all the names are different senses. And that's what reminded me also for, I think we had a conversation like 2 weeks ago about, for example, the same reference of water versus using the word water versus H2O. They refer to the same thing, but they have totally different meanings. Their sense of difference is unique and individuated and within a larger relationship of meaning, all tied together. The last note is there's a long essay discussion about the levels and the fact that God is the only one that is independent. Everything else is dependent, and explaining the degree of independence is the thing that creates existence. And that actually reminded me of discussions of the kataleo of substance, right? It's the thing that exists within itself, is independent. But that's the whole point, is that this is building on that argument by saying that even substances are dependent on God. So they're actually not really existence. It's really still subservient to God, and it's in a hierarchical relationship of basically lack, right? Basic perfection, existence, and lack, just working on a chain, basically from top to bottom. And also I bring this up because of this idea of one of the sayings of there is no God but Allah. The reason why we use that name, the name God is used twice. If you just translated Allah as God, it would just seem like a weird rendition, like no God but God. But that's something, the reason why we use that language, I think this chapter did a good job articulating that, is the importance of that word Allah. That name is something very distinct from just saying divinity, right, or God. Those are, even then, it's pointing towards it, but it's not exactly the same thing. Now those are my notes. I yield.
Yeah, I did find that fascinating too. That when he brought up the idea of God with little g, God with a big G, and still when we're talking about essence, they can point to it, but it's still not it. It's still not the essence itself. The other thing that you said about the fatherhood and the sonhood, it's just a strange thought, because I actually think Ibn Arabi can actually help Christianity a little bit in terms of, I think if the Trinity didn't use the term persons and actually use the terms relationships, I think it would actually help their case a little bit better in terms of, you could say, look, these are relationships, how you can understand father relationship, Holy Spirit relationship, son relationship, so on, rather than calling them as persons, because they always go back to this saying that it's one essence. And I think it would, I think it would help. I think it would make it easier because once you start saying persons, I mean, you're just asking for a whole lot of misinterpretation and a bunch of attacks on either side. So I do think that Ibn Arabi is kind of beneficial in this case, because I like the idea that relationships themselves, they're not exactly existent things. They're non-existent things, but they have effects. And I think that's what we're always trying to describe, is that every relationship that we have has effects. So if that's the case, that means these things are also forms, or would it be too much to stretch that to say that these things are forms and they have effects? But to go back to your independence part that you said, there was a line, there was a passage, I believe, and hopefully I can find it. Um, where it talked about, okay, here it is, I think. The highest cosmic level is independence through all things. Or if you want, call it poverty towards all things. This is the level of perfect man. For everything was created for him and for his sake and was subjected to him, since God knew of his need towards all things, so he has no independence from anything. I think that little part's a little confusing for me, but I like how it goes from, if you want to be independent as such, is actually you have to have poverty towards all things. There's a poverty towards all things. I almost feel like that's not the consensual understanding of what it means, at least when we start talking about the cultural understanding of independence. Like it's almost like the opposite, right? Like if you're, what people define as an independent person today would say that actually you have no poverty, right? And yet in this passage it's saying you have poverty towards all things. And I find that fascinating about, and this goes back to your talk on lack, Thomas, that to have this independence, it has to be done through the absolute, of course, but it's that God is constantly reminding us, and it's been quoted many times, that we are poor. We are poor towards God. And you could almost argue in that sense, that's how we have our independence. But we only have our independence in the sense that we are poor towards God. It's a whole nother ballgame if we're poor towards something that is not the real or the absolute, and so on. So what do you think about that?
I actually do think, I'm trying to be honest with you, I'm trying to pull up the text right now because it's just fascinating, because that whole use of the who is referred to as the he, who has no independence or has no dependence. And that passage, is my memory of it. I'm trying to look it up again because my understanding of that was related to man, not God. Yeah. So that's because it does change the meaning a lot, which way we mean by what it's meant by that. So I'm trying to look it up right now.
It's on 46. Yeah. And it's on the right side.
46, right side.
Yeah, it's more towards the top. It's it's right under to be poor towards all things.
On the right side.
It's on page 46.
Oh, 46. Sorry, I thought I said 47. My bad. Okay.
Michelle says it's Javier Thomas excited to listen to the conversation this evening.
Oh, well, I hope she made it up. I hope it sounds like she didn't hear my shout out to her. They're buying. Okay. Yeah. So let's see.
Yeah. Did I read it wrong?
I mean, my opinion, maybe a little bit, because before that line, the highest divine level becomes manifest within perfect man, and the highest level is that of independence from all things. But that level is only appropriate for God in essence, with respect to his essence. The highest cosmic level is independence through all things, or if you want, call it poverty towards all things. This is the level of perfect man, for everything is created for him, and for the sake he was subjected to him, since God knew of his need towards all things. Yeah. So that's the thing, that notice that his in the test, it's lowercase. At least I'm interpreting that to mean that's man. I think that's the perfect man towards all things. So he has no independence from anything. I think actually is the opposite. So my interpretation is the opposite. I would say that it says that man is dependent.
Okay.
But that's actually it is a great point. Like off the record, we were chatting, and I was doing research on reading interventions and people who have autism, and apparently we found out that in my research, I found that reading visual, basically the pronouns, the clarification of pronouns is something that improves reading comprehension for people with autism. Not there's a saying that's just funny that in this conversation, the ambiguity about pronouns changes the meaning of the text immensely. So we're way off record and format. But with that said, I do actually, regardless of the potential misunderstanding, I think Javier, your point though about the radical difference of interpretation when we say I'm an independent woman, I'm an independent man. It's actually like you're saying that literally you're not. I agree with you. It is non-poverty. It's the idea that you are independent in the sense that you're not. And I think what it means like you're not reliant on anyone, and you're not going to be affected by external causes. This is based on the modality or thinking of kind of autonomous individuals who own the moral state of things is when we get to make choices of our desires non-coerced by external forces. So the argument of freedom is basically an argument that that no one is free if anyone has any external coercion, either by nature or by people or by law or by economics to coerce their decision making and their choices and their and desires. That's a very in terms of the religious traditions, it's completely the opposite. It's a spin on the head. In fact, actually, if anything, the fates are all pointing to say, no, it's actually your wanting of things in the world that is disaster is waiting for you. The only real way to gain freedom is to abstain, right? To basically release from the need to want things, to need all these things in your life. So the poverty, it's an orientation towards poverty. We talked a little about this last week, right? It's a radically different version of it. I agree with 100% on that. And by the way, your note about the Christians and their very troublesome use of the language of persons, and just naturally every Muslim goes, wait a minute. Now, to be fair to them, Aquinas does have a section when he's saying to go, okay, what do we mean by persons? And actually the Summa talks about, like, there's a question about this point. It's like persons are individuated intellectual substances. So how can we possibly say we're saying that the Godhead is three persons? How could we not fall into a trap of basically polytheism of some variation? And the answer was, Aquinas said, there's substantial relationships. That he actually did use that language. So that's why I had a note there for Aquinas. I'll say after this call, I can send you a link to which one it was. So I thought that's just a fascinating point. So in terms of maybe the bridging the understandings a little bit is that acknowledgement these are substantial relationships. Now Aquinas doesn't explain what that means, and no one seems to really know what that means. So there's that problem. But that's a separate issue. Like that's just saying I would agree that it would be, as a fellow Muslim, I would agree that it is a problem area at the minimum. I think the last note you were bringing up just on the cycle, I disagree the idea that the forms are, right, these effects, again, actually off the record, again, when we're talking off the record of my research on reading and people with reading disabilities of different kinds, we have these effects that are empirical. We see them, our perception, right? These secondary causations, they're there. And the question is, well, why? What's the meaning? Like, why is a question of meaning. And it's interesting that, as I said off the record, it was like, I'm at this juncture. I just started this research. It started today. So I'm at this point of asking, well, why? No one's giving me an answer. And I'm actually a little perplexed about it because I'm just like, I do feel like there's a veil of understanding. I see these forms, but I do not see yet the meaning of these forms, right? These manifestations, these empirical effects, I'm seeing them, but I don't have the meaning yet. I don't have the why. which this map on what we're reading here is we see these effects of the names, justice, mercy, kingship, things like that. We see all of these manifestations, but unless we have the right understanding, we're blind to understand the primary causation, the meaning of Allah in this case for all these names. In other words, we could be very, just like, you could just see all these effects in statistical analysis, empirical results. You don't have a model of causation to interpret, frame these empirical facts. You have no understanding of it. It'll just be over the head. So this is me having a little more fun interpreting what this text is saying on my current investigations and research. But I just want to build on what Javi you're saying. I yield.
Okay. Do you think, just to kind of play along with the thing that you've been doing at work and kind of like this passage, do you think it's like this idea of levels and gradations, this kind of helps these notions of hierarchies, like you were telling me just like offline when you said when it comes to autism, highlighting the word helps them have under more comprehension. So this would be, you could say, a level. When we look to this text, this would be a level or sort of hierarchy in comparison to other modes of comprehension, where maybe a highlighted word for me wouldn't really do much for me. I'd be like, okay, cool, it's highlighted. I already understand. That it's the relationship to a word that's highlighted for me would have probably little significance, but I would be wondering why is it highlighted? So it would bring up this question of why, when in the case of someone that has autism, that the highlighted word actually increases comprehension. But if it were to be highlighted when I'm reading something randomly, I'd be like, why is that highlighted? I don't understand. So I think that's a very interesting relationship when we start talking about hierarchies and levels. But then it's I don't know. It's because in the text it talks about how everything is raised, right? Everything is uplifted in degrees. But I think it's a little difficult, at least for me as a person, to determine and say for myself confidently that this specific mode has a hierarchy over the other. I mean, I think it becomes more simple if we talk about, is the fatherhood relationship superior than the sonhood relationship? We could say yes. I feel confident in saying that there's a hierarchy in that. But when it comes to maybe trickier circumstances that it isn't very clear, maybe is that a case of running into a veil? I'm wondering.
Yeah. I mean, also, by the way, to give people context, what we're talking about here, I kind of hinted at it a little bit quickly because I didn't want to overtake the conversation with it. So my company, I started last year, Readable Technologies, and uses technology to improve reading performance. And one thing we found was we can also, using our technology, identify reading status. And our products are ADHD and dyslexia, but also in the pipeline is other conditions who have reading difficulty issues like autism. So this was just the context for my initial research, and I talked to Javier off the record about it. And the specific thing that's being talked about is that for passages that use pronouns, so he, they, she, they found that if they visually highlight, circle, underline, color the pronoun to the article, the noun that it is meant to signify, to refer to, the referent, that improved reading comprehension. And by the way, I mean, in my personal opinion, I think it's analogous to a sidewalk ramp in the sense that everybody benefits from it. Because actually, we actually on this call had a moment of pronoun confusion about which referent was the his, to be fair. So this is not necessarily, it's just, we're both reading very complicated philosophical texts, so that's perfectly fine that there might be some confusion over something like that. But the point is that it's enough of a property that it benefits. It would benefit us, for example. Actually, one we would probably investigate would be who is referred to by that pronoun. But the point is, for people with autism, apparently this benefits them immensely. Most likely because, as I said off the record, it seems gender is actually, ironically, it seems like something that's very implicit meaning, and that tends to be something that's ambiguous. So that causes confusion, and it's not implicit. It's not an explicit statement. And we talked about this too, I think, many weeks ago, about rule following, right? That rule following, to really understand religious principles, you cannot go with things as a literal. You have to take the secondary meaning, the analogous meaning. They kind of get to the heart of the law, not this hard thing that kind of blocks in and cuts reality into little bits, but to have a really mature understanding. Yeah, we had that really great circle discussion with Davud and everybody about really deep love for the principle, the law, and that it's become a genius, basically, and becoming an icon. It's someone whom the law has been so internalized and made into an invitation to interpret, which gives this dynamism and energy and all this great play potential. Anyways, I'm just riffing off these ideas to kind of play off this idea that on the levels of gradations of lack and perfection, right? The person we always need to caveat is that all the levels are beautiful, right? All of them have dignity of existence, and that word actually has meaning in the theological, because we're in a theology context. So they have their divinity, their dignity, because of the divine presence. All of them have it. It's just different degrees of it, and every level of perfection needs to be actualized. That's what God is basically permitting. So that's a Thomas Aquinas line I always like quoting, because I think it's a very beautiful one. So that's just like, these are all just gigantic caveats on. I know it's probably the most discomforting thing is, like, I think we all kind of want to play this idea of like no rules, all potential, all kind of, we don't, the idea of basically having the hardness of things. In fact, that's one of the reasons we started this group in Sufism, is right, is that Islam is a very like law kind of structure. It's like, this is the reading, and this is what you got to do. You got to do these prayers in a certain way, but not this way. You got to do it in that way. And it kind of it can kind of kill the heart. So this is kind of why, but that thing is, those laws are there for a reason, and those structures are there. And we're kind of disservicing the depth of the relationship if you don't have it. It's actually, that's why, thinking about parental relationships with fathers and sons, pure love is also giving the laws too. It's not, you don't just have do whatever you want, anytime, anyway, doesn't matter. No, a father's abstaining from his responsibilities and not truly loving his child, his son, by not giving him any laws and boundaries and cause and effect relations of these actions have consequences, and et cetera, et cetera. No one likes that, especially at the time. I know my father did this stuff to me, my parents. No one likes it at the time, but you always appreciate it afterwards. So this is me riffing off these points. Because also the big thing too is also, and as you hinted at, why, like, part of the reason why is a father superior to the son, it's because the son depends on the father. The father doesn't depend on the son. So it's actually the metric of the measure is independence. Basically, who's dependent on whom. It's partly why I love one of the line, in the structure systems of these names, right? The rich is the one who lacks, basically, who has what he needs, right? But the king is one who has everything he needs, and others depend on him. So even within the names, they have a hierarchy because of the degree of the layered of meaning built on it, and it's usually on language of dependence. That one is a very useful one because it's very directly correlated to it, what we're talking about. Okay, that's me. I yield.
Okay. So there's this, it got brought up in this text about, and just to kind of comment on what you said about laws, I think it's useful, if we were to put like the implicit in here, I think love is the implicit law. Love itself is the implicit law that kind of bounds all laws together. And even the idea of like when you look at the Quran, and it emphasizes so much about the heart, ironically, right? Even it talks about believers that explicitly say things, but they're not actually believers because their heart is actually not in it. They're saying all the things a believer would say. And the same thing with like praying. There's all these external showings of prayer, but at the same time, the prayer itself can almost be invalid because the heart is not in it, to a certain degree. So it's there is this cost about like love and heart is the reigning implicit law here. For a lot of laws, it seems like even if I were to follow a law, I have to have love for something. Truly. But anyways, there is another aspect that kind of got me here in this passage, talking about what was it? Inherent worship and accidental worship. I thought that was kind of fascinating, so I'm going to kind of read it off a little bit. It's on the top. It's like on the bottom of page 45. And it says here that actually I'll probably start a little bit more halfway through on 45. So it says, but at best, this poverty is an extrinsic and accidental need, since we are intrinsically and essentially poor only toward God. Therefore, in fact, when we have need of the secondary causes, we have need of God. The forms and phenomena are merely veils hiding God's reality, or rather various names that he assumes in disclosing himself to his creatures. Poverty towards secondary causes is in truth poverty toward the first cause. Though this argument might sound like sophistry to some people, it is strongly grounded in the Sheikh's ontology, a point that will become clear as we move along. It is intimately connected with the inherent worship that is a property of all things, as opposed to the accidental worship that human beings perform when they follow a religion. So I don't know, that actually that gave me a lot of thought, because it's like, so it means like when I'm explicitly practicing religion, if I'm understanding this correctly, if I'm explicitly doing something and practicing any religion whatsoever, this would be termed as accidental worship, when there is basically the inherent worship of all things because of their poverty towards God. So I guess there's like this universal aspect where actually we're all worshiping creatures, because that's the idea of the inherent worship, right? That's like our kind of like ontological status, like this inherent worship. But when we're doing, I guess, like a religion or something, or anything that we believe somehow explicitly, it can fall in. Would be the sort of secondary causes, I guess, right? Where would be accidental worship. I don't know. What do you think about that, Thomas? This accidental and incidental.
Well, building on the passage you're talking about, the next lines, which is quoting Ibn Arabi directly, says, where is it? God says, "O people, you are the poor towards God." Through addressing people in this way, God names himself by every name possessed by something towards which there is poverty. This is a kind of divine jealousy, so that no one should be poor towards any but him. To him who is named by the name Allah belongs in respect to the fact that to him all affairs shall be returned. The name of every name thing towards which there is poverty, whether mineral, plant, animal, man, celestial sphere, angel, or any such thing, whatever name is applied to it. Hence, he is named by every name which is possessed by every named thing in the cosmos, which has an effect within engendered existence, and everything has an effect in engendered existence. And it goes on. This is like a pretty long passage. So even it's just first of all talking about the nature of dependent, of basically that everything is in communion with God at all times. And the thing is that the manifestations of religion that we do is just one accidental point compared to, I mean, I think it is there is a Sufi saying about apparently all of existence is praising God all the time. And in God's mercy, man was allowed to basically be mute silence from that. So otherwise we go insane hearing not just the animals praying to God, but basically like the table and the clock and the wood and the tree and like everything praising God at all moments of all time, let alone angels, which is generally is recognized in all the religions and all the Abrahamic religions that the angels praise God. That's what they're doing, basically. Their existence is praising God. So it's saying that everything is doing it, just that human beings are giving a little grace and freedom to make a choice when to do it, to enter into that mode of of praising God, of coming into the right relationship, raising one's heart and mind to God, which is, I think, a great definition of what prayer is supposed to be. But that's just generally what prayer is. And the religion is meant to guide you towards that. Ideally, the religion is meant to structure you. The guide, basically, it's meant to be the guide to move you towards the right orientation to God. That would be my understanding. So I think also because he's saying that that happens naturally, that the particulars of the religion. This is where Sufis get in trouble, because they play this little game where they're like, these details. You were so worried about these details, but you miss the whole point. And then more traditional Muslims get very upset about this, because then you're basically saying, oh, wait a minute, you don't have to. What's next? You're getting some in the Quran only. No hadiths. You can play that game with me now. So this is the thing that Muslims get very upset about when this starts happening. But it's passages like this that get them in trouble when they say things like this. The generous spirit is saying that all of existence is already praising God, and we humans are the pain in the ass ones that don't all the time. So we need religion to bring us towards it. But these are in some ways an artificial adjustment to move us to what reality is doing all the time anyway, because all your illusions that you need food, you need all these other things are just illusions to God ultimately, but you can't see that because you're too dumb. If I had to summarize it. I yelled.
Do you think love and poverty are strongly related here?
You know what's funny? Because you asked me that question about this accidental religion one, which was a spicy take. I forgot to bring up your other points you made, and it kind of relates to the love poverty, specifically what you said before. For a couple notes, actually, yes, it does. But I'll tell you why. Because I have my notes. Love is the implicit law, right? That basically tells us what we should and should not do. That kind of hardness aspect of it. I wrote a note, right? The fear of the Lord. I remember in Catholicism, there's basically two modes of it Aquinas talks about. One is the kind of one where like you're afraid of basically bad things happening to you. Like, I don't want to go to hell. So that's why I fear the Lord. So that kind of oh no, I'm going to get destroyed. Like that kind of fear, like you're following the law because you don't want to get punished yourself. But then there's a higher level. And it's the level of disappointing someone that you love. Like, it's almost like basically like, I'm in a relationship. I wouldn't cheat on my girlfriend because not just because of my own birth. Like, part of it, I'm trying to articulate it the right way. I'm saying basically part of it is the fact that like cheating on her would cause so much pain for her, and me witnessing it. It's just, how could I do that? How could I possibly, for someone I love that much, to hurt them that much? to betray them, to forsake them? How could I possibly do that? So that's I think a metaphor to explain what the fear of the Lord is in the second level. It's a kind of, you don't want to disappoint him. Like you're almost like, how could I just spit in your face by doing things that just that desecrate you in what you are and what you give me. So that's a very different mode. You're not doing that out of fear of what's going to happen to you. You're doing it because out of love and respect for God. That's the higher level of the fear of the Lord, at least the way Aquinas talks about it. And I'm very empathetic to that. I'm very sympathetic. I think it's a very reasonable way of understanding. So I bring it up because part of that is saying, like, well, everything is dependent on you, God. When we talk about the poverty, when you have a deeper understanding what poverty means here, I am dependent on you. Every beat of my heart, every breath I take, every molecule of my body, the fact that I actually continue to exist at every single moment is dependent on you. And it takes a certain kind of understanding, faith, to see that, because you have to look past the secondary causations of reality, the veil of all the forms, and come to see the meaning of all these forms and realize that they all connect back to God, to Allah. And I am nothing without you. And that's the point. So that's why that's a kind of poverty of understanding and loving one's poverty too. Right? I can articulate that through that you're in love with that fact, that I'm so thankful for everything I have, because without you, I am nothing. And you could take away everything. Everything could be stripped away because it was never mine from the beginning. That's actually one of the lessons of kind of temperance, right? Or kind of temperance modes, is to realize that everything you have is just temporary. It's not your possession. It's actually one of the great fallacies of modernity, is to say that human beings have possessions of their bodies. No, you don't. All it takes is getting some disease, get cancer at 35. You tell me, or 20, leukemia when you're a child. You're telling me you own your body? No, you don't. Your body, you're renting at best. It's with a landlord that decides when it wants to go. That's just one example, but that's the point. That's just building on everything. Your wealth, depending on others, depending on wealth, health, anything. Those, even relationships, the three things that, self-help, that's a big thing. Health, wealth, relationships, like the big things. All those things are the things that can be taken away, blown away at any moment. That's why I always love Job. Job is a great story because it always reminds you of these points. So that is very much the poverty that's being discussed here, and its dynamics and understanding of it. And it's tied to this, the fear of the Lord, and having a different relationship to the Lord, the fear of the Lord. And also that, by the way, the last note you said about the sincerity of the heart, that's a huge thing in the Quran. The hypocrites. Oh my God, the hypocrites. The biggest thing you could be to go into hell is the hypocrite. That you place your name out, you're almost an oath breaker, basically. They're basically an oath breaker. That's basically what's being said here. You claim you're my friend. You claim that you love me, but yet you do these things to disrespect me, which I think we all can agree is one of the greatest betrayals you can do for someone. You claim you're a brother of mine, a lover of mine, and yet you do these things to disrespect me. And you don't even have it's like a double whammy. Not only is that kind of like, you don't even care how it has hurt me, but then also you can't even be honest with me at the same time. The backbiting, right? The two-faced moves. All these things are repeated in the Quran all over the place because it's talking about how spiritually vicious these things are and how antithetical they are to the implicit law of love, as you're saying. And that's so I want to take your points and I circle back at everything you said earlier. That they were great, and I yield.
Oh man, that's a lot. So I gotta jump on this one. When you talked about faith, because I thought this was such a good point, and you made me already connect the dots here, is that, under the fact that we have understanding is like a kind of gain, right? But to have faith is a totally different ontological, you could say, a different epistemology. It's a faith is the poverty of understanding. And I thought that was like so beautiful when it started connecting in my head, is that somehow in our modern world, we've critiqued of faith being, well, you believe, you believe in, make believe, you believe in, you just have this random faith on nothing. But actually, just the principle, if we just look at the principle of faith, I do think that there is something very humbling, something that has a lot of humility in it, because it is a poverty in understanding. And you have to have a poverty of understanding if you really want to say that you actually love someone. Because you're always going to come across something that you just simply don't understand about the person that you love. And yet you do it, you do it for them anyways, regardless of what they're saying. But another note, I found it very interesting that, just kind of make it more personal, is that, when I fall in love with somebody, right? Isn't it interesting that love is at its highest peak when both individuals had a sense of poverty? Like they came in at each other when they first met each other, when they first started talking, they didn't have anybody, right? And so love it's at its strongest when it's most poor. it's when we continue this relationship, that we get more and more out of each other, that's when the dangers start happening, because we no longer know how to have a love that has poverty, right? We don't know how to maintain that. And actually, I would say that most people kind of subconsciously realize this love as poverty, because they start having, reminiscing about the past, like, oh, remember how we used to be, remember when we used to be like this. The thing is, they don't know how to continue. They don't know how to continue that dialectic between having a love as poverty. They just try to go back to the past, or kind of moan back to the past about it. And if you try to do that, you're actually not, you're doing you're trying to gain something. Actually, now you're trying to gain something that's gone. And it actually reminds me of the Jesus verse in Luke, where a man says, uh, I want to be a follower of Jesus. And he says, okay. And he's like, well, I'll follow you, but I got to bury the dead. And Jesus says, no, the dead bury the dead. And, if you're going to follow me, the kingdom of God is here. But then there's a section toward the end where it says, it was a very powerful verse. It says, whoever holds the plow never looks back, or something like that. It was a very powerful verse about this idea of plowing, and that you shouldn't look back. And I think it's this, it has to do with, I think, directionality and poverty at the same time. Like, if you want to be towards love, you can't be looking back. You have to be going forward constantly, and also at the same time, constantly with nothing. And it reminds me of the same verses in the Bible where Jesus tells the disciples to, go to every town, but don't bring clothes with you, don't bring money, don't bring anything with you, don't even bring extra sandals, don't bring a staff. Go to house, and if they accept you, they accept you. But so it's this idea of poverty, but directionality of it. And I found that fascinating, how all of a sudden, if we don't keep this, and I think religion and laws and everything is meant to keep us, or remind us, or be placeholders for us to kind of be in a constant direction, a constant knowing of, like, look, none of this stuff that I have is mine. And one of the Bible verses that I still can't grasp, Jockin, is when Jesus says, don't worry about food, don't worry about your body, don't worry about all these other things. And yet, when you really think about it, it's like every single day I catch myself worrying about, what am I going to eat? Am I going to have enough money for my clothes? All this other stuff. So, it could be a misunderstanding of the verse, but I think ultimately you're supposed to appreciate that all these contingencies are God-given, and so with that, I'll yield.
Fun, spicy takes on this. Yeah, the very understanding what faith is very different from the kind of emotional just superstition, right? That's kind of like, it's actually the Islamic, these traditions, right, of Ibn Arabi and Al-Ghazali and everybody is pointing out that no, it's part of the older idea of like, no, the most intelligent people of societies were the religious, because the argument was faith was using the intellect's sight to see beyond the material and obvious. So that's generally the number one pre-assumption we have in the modern times, that says all the religions of these hillbilly hicks, uneducated, unintelligent, literally unintelligent, when that's historically not been the record at all. The most intelligent people were the religious. They require the most training. They require the most development. And the argument why is to actually have faith. The way we're talking about, the mind has to intellectually spike up, like kind of spark. I know that personally because my faith was very much from that act, was from there. It was very dormant, it was very quiet. It was only from studying Aristotle and his arguments of metaphysics and actuality and potential, which is basically it's the 5 causes of God, basically articulated by Aquinas, that it awoke in my intellect when I acknowledged the propositions of actuality and potential. And it was a chain reaction of intellect that made me realize, oh my God, that's that flash. It was like a flash of insight. It's a flash of faith that pulled through. And it's almost like you almost feel compelled that now it's almost like when you have a proposition that's deduced, you're kind of like forced by the proposition to accept it. You have to accept it if you accept propositions. And then you're like, well, now I have to act based on this. It's kind of similar to when you have a certain dynamic with someone, then you find out, it's always find this amazing. But I remember there's friends of mine who, or people I knew, better said, that, I was like, this person, here, actually, I want to make this very a powerful point. So I'll give you the structure of the story, but I won't say the names. This individual at a party I saw a couple years ago, this person had a son. I saw him walk away from his son and shove him. And I saw that, like, hit the ground, like push, he fell to the ground. It was like a young son. It was like a 5-year-old, 4, around that range. I remember me and my friends saw this, like me and one of my other friends saw this, and we were like horrified. We were like, who is this monster? What was this? We did not have a very strong opinion of this individual from that act. We come to find out that years later, we find out that that child basically was not his. It was infidelity, but it was not known. And doesn't condone. Obviously, I'm not condoning what occurred, but certainly, by hearing a story in a different context, it changes the whole dynamic, right? Basically, I change it. It's not even just a proposition. That's just statements of a fact, of story. Just changes the entire picture. You can't see the person the same way anymore because the new information has been given to you, and you're like, "This is true." And if it's true, I have to act. This changes the perspective of things. And that's an incredibly dramatic story, but it helps bring the point up I'm trying to say about what faith is. Faith faith done right has that same effect. You come to this realization and you're like, how can I do it? I'm compelled. I cannot do anything else. I have to accept this and have to move forward with this understanding now. That ideally is from intellectual activity, right? And it takes intellectual activity to even come to the realization, right? So as these passages will talk about, and as you said, right, it's this kind of poverty of understanding too, because that's kind of thing too. You're almost realizing, oh my God, based on what actuality and potential is, for example, what I used, I was like, there's no way. The definition of Allah being full actuality mean like that. Basically, how could you have, if by definition that's what God is? And his argument of basically lack, it's basically an argument of gradation of being. was one that really convinced for me. Lack. That moved me to say, well, therefore there must be God. And as a result, there you go. So it's a kind of inferencing through, but it's also based on as you said, a poverty of understanding that I don't have a full understanding, never going to have it because I can't. I'm inherently lacking. And also that I had a note there, basically the dark night of the soul, right? There's a long tradition in the faith about this dark night of the soul, this kind of aimlessness or kind of lostness, but yet something calling you through to know that there's a way forward. That's kind of a dynamic I'm hearing from you on this. And by the way, this whole dynamic, I remember when this used to be called the dating channel. At least this was more of a dating group YouTube channel. A conversation about intimacy and relationships and the kind of love is the highest when there's the most poverty, and then when there's a loss of it, you spend your time reminiscing about the absence. Right? I remember you talking about that in the past. If anything, this whole idea about directionality, I immediately thought the passage a couple weeks ago about basically we're all returning to God. We're just in ignorance not to realize that. And that return is either going to be by compulsion. We are going back. Question is how you're going back, which face are you going to see? So all your relationships, right? Part of the problem there is that your relationships are oriented towards you, who's a limited being, who gets satiated and falls into false comfort of thinking they got it all figured out. But in reality, your relationships should be done right, structured to God, and everything is a vehicle towards God. Because that's the end, that's where we're ending up. So you reminiscing in the past about the absences, there's not really, you're delusioning yourself because you're not looking to where you're ending up, which is you're going to die, right? And the more optimistic, the more the faith view is you're returning to God. Which face do you want to see? One last note before I return back. You said the idea of following a law requires a love of something. So this is something that this has been a pet topic of mine that I find so compelling. Well, the very fact that we follow, even in discourse and the conversations, there's law, as you said, there's implicit laws in them. There are presuppositions inside the activity of discourse, dialogue, debate that have to be there for it to even be possible to have these things. And one of them is the truth. We have to love the truth. We have to say the truth is more choice-worthy than the false. That being truthful is more worthwhile than saying something that's false, even if it's convenient for us, for some whatever reason. And that's a kind of orientation we have, right? And that's and that ties to also, by the way, following the laws of a faith, of a religion, is because you love God. That's basically second order fear of the Lord. So you're not just, you want to do it because you love God, and you would never do something to disrespect him. That'd be the orientation about it. So just meditating on these circling points. And that's the thing, your relationships to your significant other, your wife. And also, by the way, if I'm pointing, why does it matter, by the way, that you have a wife, not a girlfriend, by the way? I think that does matter. I think a lot of people today would not say that matters. I think it matters immensely because your entire orientation of the relationship is radically different. I'm very excited to get married. I want to get married because I think it's a very first of all, one, specifically because it's God's viewing it. You're saying you're doing this under God's purview. And with that orientation, because you're saying that I'm putting this relationship, not just my own subjective preferences anymore. It's put towards now a higher standard, a measure towards something more important. So I just want to meditate with these points with you, and with that I yield.
Yeah, ironically, I've been thinking about this too. This what people would dismiss as marriage, kind of being almost the same level as girlfriend and so on. But you're right; it is a radically different relationship. It's not. It's not just a piece of paper, as people like to say. But I think it has. I mean, for me personally, it has to be the lack of religious kind of overtones. Because if you think, I was thinking about this, and this is going to be a little bit of a side note. We use the term privilege now, right? And it's a sort of demeaning, kind of negative connotation to have privilege, because it means you're not doing anything. You have an advantage, right? But actually, in religious terms, it was acknowledged that there was people that were more blessed than others, right? And this has a more positive connotation, but it already had built within that system of being more blessed that you had to be the one that was giving, because that means you were not using God's gift. You were not using what God gave you to others that were less fortunate than you, right? So it's interesting that when you do this comparison between religious terms and modern terms, is that actually being blessed had a positive connotation and yet a demand. It wasn't yours, you were blessed, right? In modern context, you're privileged, it is yours, and it's negative connotation. It's very interesting. And then now when we look at marriage, and being, girlfriend and boyfriend kind of relationship, again, marriage had the same thing. Religious context, marriage is actually a blessed relationship in terms of God's view, right? Now we reduce it to, well, it's a more privileged relationship because you can get money, you can get more money out of it, you can have each other in the same bank account, or eventually divorce each other and sue each other for money. There's all these sort of privilege benefits you can get for being married, and so it gets reduced to transactional means. And it's very important that you could say, actually, this idea between blessed and privilege as names or as words, there's a loss of a level here. There's a loss of a name here that used to be very important. Just to kind of throw in Ibn Arabi, is that I think, and this is where I'm kind of adamant about this idea, is that if we bring back the word blessed, it wouldn't, I feel like it wouldn't have the kind of irritation that it brings to a lot of people when they hear privilege, right? And then this whole aspect of guilt, right? Because actually, being blessed is a good thing in the context of what God gave you, but it's also a demand. But you see how horrible it becomes when it's stripped of its principle. When it gets stripped of the God principle, it's privilege. And then we just make monsters out of each other for everything. Because, well, in every comparison, everybody is privileged in certain degrees. Whether we become victims or perpetrators, everyone's privileged in certain aspects, right? There's just the way it kind of goes. So I find that kind of interesting when we bring this idea of levels, gradations, hierarchies, marriage as it's lost from going from a blessed relationship to more just like, it's just a piece of paper, it's a transaction, it's just a privilege. And boyfriend and girlfriend, I mean, what is it? I think I saw a random YouTube short talking about how Rome tried to ban cheating, like basically people from cheating and having intercourse with people that weren't married, and they put laws to stop it. Like the punishment was death, and they couldn't even stop it. And yet at the same time, the population was decreasing because nobody was getting married. They weren't trying to have kids. They were just trying to have intercourse and all that. And I think it's interesting how if one relationship exists, right, and we make marriage devoid, then we really almost implicitly feel the loss of that hierarchy. And people don't realize that, I think. But they do feel that loss. I would argue that they still feel that loss of that kind of hierarchical relationship. It's just now we get stuck at between so many names in the dating game itself. Oh, we're talking, so I'll yield.
I mean, it's kind of funny. in the one I kind of like where we're going with this, only because the general trend I find in human relationships in society is ones of accelerating ambiguity and anxiety, because ultimately we can't trust each other because we don't have any foundations of stability to rely on trust. Not to say the past was some golden age where everything was awesome, obviously not. But actually, yeah, I had a conversation with Michelle. Actually, Michelle, are you still watching? Thank you for listening for so long.
She is.
Thank you. Remember we had our conversation about relationships, and one of the themes was this gnawing, rampant anxiety of not being able to rely on each other, because ultimately you're not part of one of the things people need in relationships is common standards or common measures or common structures that we are both agreeing to, that there's something more important than my individual preferences and my individual wants, which is the pretense of what you're saying. Why is a marriage a blessed relationship? It's because there's something higher. And controversial as it is now, that apparently are, as we saw in the law cases, is no longer acknowledged by the definition of marriage, is raising kids. The reason you're married is to have kids. That's no longer in the law. That's not a presumption anymore. But that is a higher structure. Like, you're here for a specific reason together. That's something that can only be done together, by the way. So you have it sets a context that's higher than you. And that's a very basic one. That's a very material basic one, by the way. That's not even going to the higher levels of what a blessed relationship is meant to be, which is our orientation, not just to you, to your partner, but also to God. That's only gone. If you basically treat marriage as you said, a piece of paper of privilege, of resources, basically, that's all it is. It's just dead matter. There's no soul. There's no spirit in it, basically. And I agree. Loss of a name is a very great way to put it. And it's funny enough, we get that replaced with a bunch of ambiguous, meaningless names. I'm seeing someone. We're talking. We're on a break. All these things. It's just rampant ambiguity and actually lack of trust. And I would say it actually basically deadens sincerity. How could you have a sincere relationship, a commitment? How could it possibly be done if you have this underhinge of anxiety and ambiguity in the entire dynamic? That ultimately, yeah, you're with me now, but because it's convenient for you. If it was no longer convenient, will you be there for me? And so literally, what's the first lines of any vow in marriage? Till death do us part, for sickness and health, blah, 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 blah. Like, the entire pretense is that regardless of the invariabilities of existence and how much gets taken away or how much is given, there's something that subsists, that has substance, that stands. And that's incredibly antithetical. I mean, we're going outside the text wildly in some degree here in this discussion, but another way we're not. Because also the big part too of this is that all of these are meant to be possessions given to us. We don't actually own them, right? So this is actually the main thing I think you're getting at with this blessed versus privileged point of view. I think it's very true. The idea that those who are blessed, or those who recognize any advantages or resources they have or talents, is not for them, but for God. And I mean, yeah, there's a great line in the Bible, basically the talents, right? Basically, the whole story is basically the one that chose to do nothing with it. What was given to him, he was castrated. Basically, he was like, it was like, you're a worthless white. You are nothing to me. Everything will be taken from you. It's kind of amazing because it's very much like Jesus basically coming through in these Bible verses, like this, this is like the dictator tyrant mode we don't usually associate with Jesus. That also he had this character sometimes to do this. A face of God. We're going to use this metaphor to talk about it. But with that said, that's a very different orientation to basically privilege, right? That has an advantage, and you're exploiting, right? And actually, it's funny enough. Actually, I was having pizza with a friend yesterday, a self-avowed communist, right? And talking about exploitation between worker and employer, right? And I went on a basic point. It's like, well, wait a minute. So you're saying that you would want equality between them? I was like, yes, those exploitations. We have to avoid exploitation. That's wrong. But I'm like, wait a minute. You know that word exploitation is a very charged word. You're giving very clear claims with that term, like that's charged. So I said, so you're telling me that any time is inequality. That's wrong. Basically, it's morally wrong. He was basically saying yes. And I said, but wait a minute. If there's no inequality, there's no exchange. You have no reason to exchange with anyone if there's no inequality. Anyways, I'm not going to go and bore you with the economics debate about it. But the basic point, look at the orientations are totally radically different. First, from seeing inequalities as being basically justified, that there are differences of things, and that's a good thing because it allows for dynamics of collaboration, interaction, commerce, intercourse, all these things, versus treating them as these are horrendous, evil inequalities. You have things that I don't have. I want those things. It's just like what a degree of spiritual, basically, disgust and poverty, in my opinion. One orientation is versus the other. Just look at the orientation, the kind of spirit behind it. Because it's also ironic because usually the ones who have that claim of privilege and argument that things are taken, we need to take things from other people. Look at the sense of coercion that is required as a consequence. Versus the ones who are blessed feel this inclination. I need to give this to people. I need to give. Radically different points of view. Just from the changing of language. So I would agree with you. Those names are very powerful names that have very powerful differences. And when you apply that to a relationship like that, becomes either marriage or becomes, well, quite frankly, this cesspool of modern dating. That's just rampant narcissism, psychopathy, and hedonism just kind of mix all together into a gigantic spew of ambiguity and anxiety. And with that, I'm going to yield.
It's I think this text has shown to me how important the orientation is, how we begin our orientation, because if we have a materialist orientation, like towards lack, then we get words like privilege, we get words like exploitation, we get words, very charged words, to be honest, very charged words. Even the idea of gender roles, right? If we have strictly materialist and physical just values attached to them, they become charged, right? People start entertaining the idea, well, this is misogynistic, this is patriarchal, this is so on and so on. But actually, if you entertain the God-oriented position, man and wife, they do things for each other because it's the means, they are the bridges towards God, right? You both as a unity, as we'll just kind of use biblical language, as one flesh, right? When you become one flesh, when you get married and you become one flesh, you have to be poverty towards God. And that means when you treat each other, it's always poverty towards God. But see, that's the problem, is that when you start stripping relationships of their ontological principle, their God principle, you get a materialistic principle. And yes, that's right. You will see misogyny. You will see sexism. You will see abuse of hierarchy and everything. And the ironic part is that stripping the God principle is not going to stop. It's not going to stop the abuse of the hierarchy, because there's always going to be some type of hierarchy, because how would we relate to each other? Like you said, right? There has to be some type of unequal relationship in order for us to have an interaction. And, even though it can be argued that, yes, people have abused these types of relationships in marriage, even though while professing a type of faith towards God and so on. Yes, I mean, that happens, but we have to think in terms of the principle, in theory, that actually when the marriage's function is actually has its direction towards God, not towards each other. And I think a lot of people mistake when they kind of combat the notions of marriage and having a God relationship and of marriage and so on, because they think of its, misogyny and so on, and all these claims, is that it's like, yes, you have that position because you're stripping it of the God principle. When you have just a materialistic position, a materialistic orientation, and so do the individuals, meaning the man and the wife, then yes, you entertain the very facts of misogyny, patriarchy, abuse, rape. All these things are quite evident, and they're very possible there because they're not having a real poverty towards God. And those relationships were blessed because they were substantiated on being as a poverty towards God. And that even having a child, even having a child is not a curse or not, a condemnation, but a blessing, because there's people that can't have children. So again, it's this idea that all of our relationships are poverty towards God. And that's very important, because if we don't have that sort of orientation, you see how the words change completely, how everything becomes so charged, so almost so ugly, so almost so hopeless, really. It's exploitation, misogyny, sexism, there's rape, there's all these things. And why? Because those are things that exist because they refuse to be satisfied with poverty, any notion of poverty. And with that, I yield.
I mean, my one point to build on it, just based on what we're talking about tonight, is also not just I agree with you absolutely. The spiritual theistic orientation versus material. One other note related to it is independent versus dependent. Remember I said earlier, one of the big projects of modernity is saying that human subjects are independent, and the entire project of freedom is to release man from all coercive external pressures by tradition and culture and government, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, this is just basically the same orientation versus what the text is saying today is that in actuality, you're dependent of God. You're naive. You're completely ridiculous if you think somehow you're not dependent on God, because everything you have was given from God and will go and you will be stripped away from. The only things I don't know if I forgot it's a hadith or a saying in Sufism, but the whole point is when you die, nothing's coming with you in the revival when you get our next bodies. When the last days come, the only thing coming with us is our virtues. That's the only thing staying with us. That's it. Everything else, dust. Everything's going to dust until then. And then after that, by the way, everything's getting annihilated except for God. But that even then, just as the prelude before the final annihilation, the only thing coming with you is your virtues. That's it. Everything else, your body, your health, relationships, gone. Woo, money, gone. All that gone. So that orientation, I think, is a great way to close out this discussion, because that is fundamentally the distinction of what this passage is trying to talk about and understand about what the names are even meaning, because your orientation to the names radically changes if you understand the why behind them, right? The meaning of Allah to the names versus just seeing them surface wise, because your orientation is materialistic and they're independent. So you think you own your own shit and everything's yours and you're going to be so great and you're all hot shit and everything you did was because of you and everything anyone does bad things to you, cuts you off in traffic, steals from you, et cetera, et cetera. They're all crimes against you and your possessions and all this stuff. Because, as you said, it's very slow-minded, and the reason why these names are beautiful, by the way, those names of God, is because they're so encompassing and so large and so generating, right? That's the beauty is always said, right? Basically, is an act of perception and knowing, but the beauties of the body and anything physical are just hints of what usually everyone says what real beauty is, which is spiritual acts, virtues, things like that. These kind of beautiful things in the soul are much more powerful, but require an intellect to see and to understand. But it's all very much all this is always about orientation towards lack. I would agree. And that's the ultimate, also one of the big things too, is that your orientation in epistemology, what you know, is very much tied to what kind of person you are. That's also very it's a very fundamental difference of the modern times to the past and religious understanding. Very much the kind of person you were determined what you would actually know and understand. That's very different to now, where we think basically everyone by just Googling and reading Twitter, they're going to know everything. Become foreign policy experts, then epidemiologists, and then once we go to Mars, they're going to become space experts, space travel, all from just some Googling and Twitter. And thinking just they don't have to change. They don't have to actually go through the process of learning to transform and change themselves. They can just do a surface Twitter read and some Google searching, and all of a sudden now they're knowledgeable. Like their epistemology can now be informed, even though they don't change themselves. Okay, with all that, I yield. Very spicy take today. We got some spicy takes in this call.
I know we did. I'm going to read real quick some of what Michelle said here. She said she's liking the conversation. She said, yes, lack of trust because we don't trust lack. And to kind of close out my portion here, when I was talking about the orientation, it's really important to think, is that this idea of inherent worship is so critical, because it really does matter what face of God you choose to see. Because if you choose a materialistic point, that's the face of God you see, really. And one of my favorite hadiths, favorite hadiths is when it said, "I am as my servant thinks of me." And that is so important. That is so important, because even if it's this element of transfiguration that's so important, because it really matters how you mirror yourself and how you view the world and how it mirrors itself, because if that's what you want to see, if you want to see exploitation, that's what you get, almost, right? Rather than people not using their blessed state, right? They're not attributing, right? So if you want to see a materialistic world, you're going to get a materialistic world. If you want to see another type of world, that's what you're going to get. And I think, to kind of go back again to the text, is that these are all forms that we're talking about here. These are forms. And it said that if we take one as a Lord, that we're going to run up against the wall here. They're not going to let us see past or allow us to see past the veils, because the veils are sort of designed so that we could see past. But the problem is, as we work up through levels, we're supposed to kind of have this constant state of poverty in order to go through the next station. But unfortunately, is that the moment we become satisfied, the moment we take something or a form as Lord, then we get blocked in. And that's the problem. That's you could say that's where I start thinking about this hadiths, where I am as my servant thinks of me, because the essence itself is ultimately unknowable. But wonderful talk, and yes, we had very spicy spicy takes on this. So but I don't know if you have just like a last minute cue in, and okay.
Nope, we're good. It's been a fun conversation. Thank you for making this happen today.
All right, thanks, Thomas. All right, with that, we'll close. Thank you guys for watching. All right, bye.